Cottage, Tenant by Frank Belknap Long. When we were children, Cruson said, trying hard to sound thoughtful and wise, the old English nursery rhymes and tales of Greek gods unaging seemed just the right kind of reading for 8-year-olds. No one would have dreamed of putting them on a restricted list, but I'm afraid that today... He broke off abruptly to stare at Susan Jane, who was 2 years short of 8, and at his son, Timothy, whose recent birthday had made him 9. They bore a remarkable family resemblance, and though his son was the best looking, Susan Jane could hardly have been thought of as plain. He avoided looking directly at his wife until Anne Cruson said,
"That's nonsense, and you know it. Complete, absolute, total nonsense. What would you have them read? Sociological tracts?"
Instead of replying instantly, Cruson allowed his thoughts to stray. It seemed such a pity, in a way. No young married couple, he still refused to let 10 years alter his perspective in that respect, could have achieved more harmony and fulfillment if just one fly in the ointment could have been set aside. They had an attractive white cottage overlooking the sea, with flowering plants and bright shells in the sun parlor, and the wide half-acre of lawn that sloped down to the sea was a miracle of smooth emerald enchantment, with pathway of white gravel leading to the wharf and a small cabin cruiser riding at anchor close to the end of it. They were both employed as well, Anne as second in command at a tourist-frequented village antique shop, and himself as a junior high school principal. But somehow they could never seem to agree concerning what was best for the children. It wouldn't have mattered much if Timothy didn't say things at times which alarmed him. He was doing that now, raising his eyes from the book he'd been reading in a sprawled-out position on the floor to comment on what his mother had just said.
"I don't believe any of these stories," he said. "The fall of Troy wasn't like it says here. No one saw what came out of the sea, just a stupid big wooden horse. All right, there were soldiers inside the horse, and they set fire to Troy and burned it down. But the Greeks couldn't have done that without help. They were told what to do every minute."
"Oh, sure," Cruson muttered sarcastically, his concern blotted out for an instant by irritation. "But how do you account for the fact that Virgil and the Greek dramatists didn't view it that way at all? Poets are supposed to be inspired, perspective far beyond the average. How could they have written about the fall of Troy as they did if they had suspected there was something hidden and hideous about the sea where the Greek ships rode at anchor? This isn't the first time you've let yourself take that tale apart in a silly way, but the time has come to put a stop to it." To his surprise, Cruson found himself quoting, "Troy has perished, the great city. Only the red flame now lives there." "That's poetry, Tim boy, great poetry, and when I was your age, those stories meant a lot to me. But kids today, well, that kind of reading seems to do more harm than good. Perhaps because life has become too complicated in too many different directions. I don't know, but if a more realistic kind of reading could be substituted, I'm sure I wouldn't be so worried about you, and that means a lot to a father."
"Darling, just let him say what he pleases," Anne protested. "All children have strange ideas at times. They exaggerate just one aspect of experience out of all proportion. It's all part of the growing-up process."
"It's nothing he could have experienced," Cruson retorted. "He wasn't there."
"Neither was Virgil."
"What does that mean? What are you trying to tell me? That if a boy his age lets his imagination run riot, he's doing something we should encourage, if only because it's harmless and can be chalked up to the marvelous imagination of children? There was nothing childish about Virgil. You'd realize how ridiculous all this is if you'd put Timothy's meanderings into an adult frame of reference."
"You're better at that than I am," Anne said. "What frame do you have in mind?"
"One of simple plausibility. Timothy is sure that something monstrous and long buried came up out of the sea and took possession of the Greek intelligence. Not one person in 10,000, child or adult, would have hit on so freakish a conjecture. No, not one in a million. Its very freakishness makes it grotesque, and it disturbs me. Besides, Cruson added, to have taken possession of the Greek intelligence in the Homeric age would have required some doing, even for a sea monster. Ulysses survived every encounter with monsters on land and sea, remember. It was a poor attempt at humor, and Cruson knew it. But he was beginning to feel that if he didn't dismiss lightly what his wife had been saying, he might end by taking one small part of it seriously. He had never come close to accepting Jung's theory of archetypal images, and only a Jungian would have been willing to concede that Timothy might have dredged up something out of his collective unconscious that was both deeply buried and unusual. Solely to keep himself from dwelling on that, Cruson set his lips in tight lines, swung about, and crossed to the door of the sun parlor in 3 long strides.
"Where are you going, Daddy?"
Susan Jane asked. "Just for a walk on the beach," Cruson said, opening the door with a wrench. It always seemed to stick on damp days, and there had been a gray overcast since morning. The fog that had drifted in from the sea had thinned a little, however, and there was a brightness where the sun was trying to break through. If the beach just stayed the way it was, he told himself, it would be just right for the kind of stroll he enjoyed most. The tang of the brine in his nostrils, a good visibility for 2 or 3 yards ahead, and enough scattered seashells underfoot to keep him occupied in a pleasantly active way. Not that he shared Timothy's interest in collecting shells of all shapes and sizes, but he did like to stop occasionally, pick one up, and send it skimming out across the surf line. An unusual shell, or a stranded spider crab or jellyfish, gave him a boyish kind of thrill, just why he could not have said. Certainly they were abundant enough on every stretch of New England coastline in the wake of a slight storm, and should have been familiar enough to a New Englander born and bred to stir no interest at all.
"Supper will be on the table in just 20 minutes,"
Anne said.
"Why did you have to pick this time to go for a walk?"
"I always seem to pick the wrong time for just about everything," Cruson said. "I'm truly and honestly sorry, Anne."
"Oh, forget it,"
Anne said.
"Perhaps I married you for that reason. I'm a strange woman in many ways. I guess you've discovered that by now."
Cruson shut the door very quietly behind him. He walked down the white gravel path to the wharf, and then struck eastward across the narrow stretch of beach which fringed his property for close to half a mile in both directions. The fog had cleared surprisingly fast, and he could see, not just 2 or 3 yards ahead, but as far as the bleak, ragged ledge of rock which ran out into the bay where Richard Forbes's sailboat was anchored. It was a trim, handsome craft, and had much in common with Forbes himself, who prided himself on his popularity with women. Cruson had often found himself wondering how much the attractive blondes and redheads, only rarely a brunette, Forbes took on brief excursions around the bay, appreciated the absolute perfection of the boat's lines and the dent its cost had made in his playboy's income. Probably not excessively. Forbes had kept them too busy. The sailboat was on Cruson's property, but the water was unusually deep on both sides of the rock projection, and he had been only too happy to make Forbes a present of that mooring facility. Halfway on the rock projection, Cruson paused for an instant to stare down at an enormous horseshoe crab, which the recent blow had cast up upon the beach in an upside-down position. It was wriggling its legs furiously in its effort to right itself, and he was moved by pity to bend down, pick it up, and toss it far out beyond the small waves that were lapping at the sand a few feet from where he was standing. A strange thought came into his mind. What Timothy had said about the Greek ships riding at anchor in an age remote from ours, but not in the least ancient to a horseshoe crab. For uncounted millions of years, horseshoe crabs have survived unchanged, passed over by an evolutionary process that had brought about the rise and fall of the dinosaurs. He had just started to walk on when he heard the screaming. Two voices seemed to be screaming in unison, one unmistakably that of a woman, and the other even more unnerving because it wasn't often that a man screamed in just as high-pitched accents of masculinity. He had no doubt at all that the screams were coming from the anchored sailboat. The beach was unoccupied by human forms as far as the rock projection, and when screams drifted ashore across a short stretch of water, they had to come either from someone thrashing about in the water or from a boat, and there were no desperately struggling forms anywhere in the water. Cruson had always believed that it was a mistake to break into a run unless someone in need of help was in immediate critical danger. A swift stride could lessen the danger of stumbling, and when the distance was very short, the loss of a few seconds was more than offset by a gain in purposeful assurance. He moved swiftly enough, keeping parallel with the surf line, but avoiding a too close approach to the narrow ribbon of sand which the waves had left wet and soggy. He was soon within wading distance of the boat, with the rock ledge stretching out in front of him like the fan-like crest of some enormous lizard half buried in the sand. The tide was receding, but that did not mean that he could reach the anchored craft solely by wading. But the distance he might have to cover by swimming would, he felt, be so short that untying his sneakers and kicking them off would needlessly delay him. The screams had stopped, but before the water reached to his knees, other sounds came to his ears, a creaking and a shuffling, followed by a groan that made him pause for an instant to stare at the boat's rail. He could see nothing, and continued on until the water rose to his shoulders. He was less than 30 feet from the boat when the depth of the water ruled out further walking. He surrendered to the buoyancy of the tide and swam toward the almost stationary craft with a breaststroke, feeling that an overhand crawl would have been an absurdity. So short was the distance that he was at the rail, grasping it firmly and heaving himself across it before the frog-like movements of his legs had made more than a slight swirl in the water. There were two people in the sailboat, both of whom he recognized. Richard Forbes was dragging himself across the foredeck, one hand pressed to his side, and the other grasping the loose end of a coil of rope that kept unraveling like a snake in his clasp. His features were distorted with what could have been either stark terror or dazed incomprehension. It was impossible for Cruson to tell. His jaw sagged, and his eyes had a slightly filmy look. Slumped on the deck a few feet from him was perhaps the most strikingly beautiful of a dozen or more women who had accompanied Forbes in a sailing cruise around the harbor and often further in coastal waters in the past year and a half. Helen Tanner was 30 or 32, but she had the rosy-cheeked complexion of a girl of 17. Only now most of the rosiness had vanished, and she looked haggard-eyed and drawn. Her pale blonde hair, dampened by the fog, clung to her brow in such a way that, quite suddenly and appallingly, made Cruson think of Medusa's coils. She had seemed to be bearing up fairly well, but the instant Cruson looked directly at her, her expression changed, and she screamed once shrilly, and then fell silent with the look that might well have turned Perseus to stone. It was a terrible, fathomless look, as if she had gazed on something so monstrous that it had drained away all that was womanly in her. But still, despite all that, she seemed to want desperately to tell him what had happened to bring her to such a pass. Her lips moved, twitching spasmodically, and she raised herself a little more, and her hand went out toward him. He moved toward her on his knees. Getting to his feet had seemed less urgent than reaching her before she collapsed, and took firm hold of her hand. "What is it?" he breathed. "What has happened here? Did Forbes try to attack you?" She shook her head. "No, oh God, no. He's badly hurt. Can't you see? It's toward his side. Caught him." Forbes' voice came then, as if from a great distance, as if the air surrounding him had changed into a swirling vortex, carrying him far away in space and time. There was a deadness in his voice, a hollowness, yet it seemed laden with anguish as well. It was like a mist at first, a mist that crept in over the rail. I thought it was just the fog, coming back again, getting quickly denser, as fogs often do. Cruson released his tight grip on Helen Tanner's hand, swung about and stood up, a little surprised by the steadiness in his legs. He was grateful for the slight swaying of the boat, for it enabled him to cross to Forbes' side in a somewhat lurching way. Otherwise, he might have given Forbes the impression that he was sturdily in command of himself, and he did not want to do that. A man or woman in great distress, in need of support, likes to think that he is not alone in experiencing inner torment. The comforter, Cruson knew, has to be a little shaken himself if he is to provide a wholly sympathetic kind of support. He took as firm a hold of Forbes's shoulder as he had of Helen Tanner's hand, and cautioned, "Perhaps you'd better not try to talk. Suppose you just let me have a look at your side. The wound may not be as bad as you think." Forbes made no attempt to rise, but he removed the hand that had been pressed to his side, exposing a dull red stain that was triangular in shape. His sport shirt was badly ripped, with pinpoints of glistening redness on the torn cloth where it clung to the wound in frayed strips. He shook his head when Cruson bent to examine more closely one of the lacerations, which seemed the opposite of a superficial scratch. "No sense in looking at it," Forbes said, quickly replacing his hand. "I know how bad it is. Its talons were like little knives. If they had been longer—" "Its talons?" "I tried to tell you. Why did you stop me? It was like a mist at first, and then it changed. It changed into some kind of animal. It was jet black and had 4 limbs and a head. The head kept getting larger, and there were eyes in it, and I think it had a beak. But I can't be sure, because something happened to my mind. I could see nothing clearly after that." "Did you try to defend yourself when it attacked you?" Cruson heard himself asking. "Did you struggle with it?" Forbes let go of the rope he'd been gripping and pounded the deck with his fist, as if just remembering what had happened demanded some kind of emotional release. "I couldn't move. I tried to back away from it, tried to get the rail behind me for support, but it rose up and flung itself at me while I was in a state of shock. There was a heaviness in my legs, and the deck looked warped, twisted up. It must have done something to my mind." "It didn't attack Miss Tanner?" "No. She tried to make it let go of me. She screamed and tugged at it. I don't know why it didn't turn on her. You can see what just the sight of it has done to her." "It may have been the feel of it," Cruson said. "I didn't ask her." "Please don't," Forbes said, staring across the deck to where Helen Tanner was still sitting motionless, her shoulders now a little hunched, and her fingers pressed to both sides of her brow. "She's been through enough." The salt sea air, which had always meant so much to Cruson, seemed suddenly an unhealthy kind of air to breathe. He found that he could not take seriously a great deal of what Forbes had said, but something could have come flopping up out of the sea and landed on deck, probably had. A seal, perhaps. They were not unheard of in New England waters. Then some kind of wild hysteria could have gripped both Forbes and Helen Tanner, and... But how explain the lacerations on Forbes' right side and his ripped shirt? Could Helen Tanner have succumbed to so wild a fright that she had lost all contact with reality and lunged at him with the knife, mistaking him for whatever it was that had flopped over the rail to the deck? But if she had done that, what had happened to the knife? Cruson came to a quick, firm decision. He bent and took steadying hold of Forbes's shoulder for a second time. "We've got to get you to a hospital," he said. "I'll go ashore and come right back and drive you both to East Windham. Miss Tanner needs immediate medical attention. The worst wounds are not always physical." "You can say that again," Forbes muttered, with a slight upward tilt to his lips that didn't quite result in a smile. It was past midnight when Cruson returned to the cottage after a two-way 50-mile drive. He put the car back into the garage and walked warily up the white gravel path to the door of the sun parlor, surprised by its lighted-up aspect. The instant he passed through the door, he was greeted by Timothy with an open book still in his hand.
"What happened, Dad?" he asked. "What did they say at the hospital? Were they surprised?"
"Naturally they were surprised," Cruson said. "A man with a bad wound in his side he can't readily explain away, and a woman half out of her mind." He looked steadily at his son for a moment, then demanded, "Why are you up so late? I hope you have an excuse that stands up. I'm sure it can't be because you were worried about me."
"I never worry about you, Dad," Timothy assured him. "You can take care of yourself."
"I often wonder about that," Cruson said. Going for a walk when supper was practically on the table wasn't such a bright idea in view of what happened on the beach.
"Do you believe Mr. Forbes' story?" Timothy asked.
"I'm sorry I even mentioned what happened when I came back to get the car," Cruson said. "Now look, forget about that excuse. What I want you to do is go straight upstairs to bed. You've done enough reading for today."
"The Grecian ships,"
Timothy began. Cruson suddenly became as angry as he was capable of becoming in the presence of his son. "You heard me. Straight upstairs to bed. I'm very serious, Timothy."
"All right, but I just wanted you to know that what happened to Mr. Forbes wasn't my fault. I couldn't have stopped it if I hadn't been reading about the fall of Troy."
It confirmed everything that Cruson had feared. Stories of heroes and mythological monsters and ancient cities famous in song and legend might or might not be just the right kind of reading for children living under the shadow of the bomb. But even if that could be debated pro and con, it was the worst possible kind of reading for his son. It was Timothy, above every other child in the world, that he had been seeking to safeguard in taking what his wife had considered a ridiculous stand. Was it already too late? Had Timothy lost all contact with the world of sobriety and common sense? Childhood schizophrenia? It was a horror he refused to dwell on. Not tonight, not after all he had endured. It had been even worse at the hospital, in a way, than when he'd heaved himself up over the rail of Forbes's boat and looked into Helen Tanner's fathomless, terror-haunted eyes. At the hospital she had collapsed again, and they had carried her, shrieking and raving, into the emergency ward. It had taken 2 strong interns to control her. "Timothy," Cruson said.
"What is it, Dad?"
"Forgive me if I spoke a little harshly. Just go upstairs now and turn in, and try not to wake your mother. She may be needing all the sleep she can get."
"But don't you want to know why?"
"I don't want to hear anything more tonight," Cruson said, silencing his son with a look which would have been unwise for Timothy to ignore. "We'll talk about it tomorrow." As soon as Timothy had vanished in the darkness at the top of the staircase, Cruson took a slow turn up and down the sun parlor. It wasn't even a moon parlor now, since the night beyond its wide-paned windows was inky black, and the instant Timothy had ceased to make the stairs creak, he had reached up and pulled the chain on the hanging electric bulb which his son had left blazing. He had no particular desire to join his family upstairs. Anne, he knew, would go right on sleeping and not miss him at all unless she happened to wake up, and if she did, she would take for granted that he'd chosen to spend the rest of the night on his favorite couch. Timothy would tell her that he'd returned safely, even if she didn't come downstairs to make sure. Probably she wouldn't, because he'd made a habit of sleeping on the couch several times a month, where the air was cooler on hot nights. It was something Anne did herself at times, creeping downstairs in the middle of the night and leaving him to slumber on in the heat in their upstairs bedroom. The couch was quite long and spacious, and since it was on the side of the sun parlor where a cool breeze from the sea blew in most strongly, if just one window remained raised, all Cruson had to do was stretch himself out at full length and relax. It creaked a little as he eased himself down, making him decide to oil the springs in the morning. He sighed, turned on his side, and almost immediately fell asleep. Just how deep it was, he had no way of knowing. He knew only that he awoke once, aware of an unusually strong sea smell in the room, but was far too drugged with sleep to pay it much attention. In a deep, half-conscious way, he remained aware of it for perhaps a full minute, but so overwhelming was his drowsiness that when it became no stronger, he made no effort to resist the tug of slumber. When he opened his eyes again, the sun parlor was no longer in total darkness. There was a faint glow in the eastern sky, and though the light which had crept in through the windows was too dim to enable him to see more than the shadowy outlines of the furniture, 3 chairs, a flower-stand, and a small circular table, he could make out something huge and misshapen in a far corner that should not have been there at all. It was too solid-looking to have been a shadow, and there was nothing in the sun parlor that could have cast one of that shape and size. For a moment, Cruson wasn't in the least frightened. There were so many ways of explaining something like that, a big chunk of bark from the dead oak on the lawn, ripped from the trunk and blown through the open window by a fierce gust of wind in the night, or something Timothy had lugged downstairs in the small hours, being too restless to sleep and wanting something to do, or just possibly, but no, it was far too large to be a cat or a woodchuck or a skunk. The chill began when he realized that thinking it might be some animal that had climbed through the window while he slept might very well be the truth. It got worse when he began to move about, sending so great a coldness lancing up through him that his lips began to shake. He sat up abruptly, as wide awake as he had ever been, jolted by an awareness of danger so acute that it drove every vestige of slumber from his brain. Only the dimness of the light prevented him from seeing it clearly, for his vision had ceased to be even slightly blurred. There was something vaguely parrot-like about it, but its body did not seem in the least bird-like, and it moved with a scraping sound, as if its feet were claw-tipped. Cruson was shaking violently and uncontrollably now. He knew that he possessed as much courage as most men, but when a breath from the unknown blew cold upon anyone, man or woman, courage became a relative thing. It had always been that way from the rude beginnings of human life on earth. There was a breath, sea-bottom fetid, as if some decaying shellfish had been stirred into a vaporized broth and sprayed into every corner of the sun parlor. It was moving toward him more swiftly now, swaying as it advanced, and making a sound that he had never associated with an animal of land-dwelling habits. It was neither a growl nor a cat-like whining, but a kind of blubbery smacking together of what may or may not have been lips. Suddenly it reared up and appeared to increase in bulk, and that abrupt change in its attitude seemed to do something to the light. There was a sudden brightness high up under the ceiling, bringing into view an enormous shining beak and 2 eyes as large as dinner plates that were trained so fiercely upon Cruson that he could feel the heat of them searing his pupils and burning its way into his brain. There was an abrupt loud clattering on the stairs, followed by a thud. It brought about an instant dimming of the light again. The beak and the eyes hovered for the barest instant in the diminished glow, and then whipped away out of sight. The high-rearing bulk of the monstrous shape began to dissolve as Cruson stared, growing more and more attenuated, until nothing but a thin curtain of revolving mist lingered between the couch and the corner of the room from which it had emerged. And in another moment even the mist was gone. Cruson's trembling had not stopped, but, shaken as he was, he somehow managed to stand up and to jerk at the chain of the hanging light-bulb, which he'd turned off long ago, in another age, surely, some immeasurably remote period in time when his sanity had not yet deserted him in quite so total a way. The instant the sun parlor became flooded with light, he saw Timothy. He was lying at the foot of the stairs in a sprawled-out heap, with no trace of animation in his limbs or features. His eyes were tightly shut, and he was pajama-clad, and there was a swelling, dark bruise on his forehead, which was visible from where Cruson stood. It was the bruise, more than anything else, which brought Cruson to his son's side with a concern so acute that he staggered and almost fell. He bent and gathered Timothy into his arms and started shaking him, not trusting himself to speak. Timothy opened his eyes and stared up at him.
What happened, Dad? I was just starting to... Did I trip? Yeah, I must have taken a tumble. Everything went black.
You had a very bad fall. Cruson heard himself muttering, his concern suddenly less acute. Are you all right? Do you feel all right? Not dizzy or anything?
Maybe I'll feel dizzy if I stand up, Timothy said, but I guess not. I feel pretty good.
I'm glad of that, at least, Cruson said, but I don't know why you should feel good after giving me a scare like that. Why did you come downstairs at this hour? Tell me.
I stayed up all night, Dad. I was reading in bed. Then I started worrying about what might happen if I kept thinking about what happened when the Greek ships...
Stop right there, Cruson ordered. We're not going into that again. Not now, or ever again. Do you understand? I don't want to hear about it.
All right, Dad, but that smell will keep coming back.
Cruson's heart skipped a beat. What smell? He demanded. What are you talking about? Just the fact that he knew only too well what Timothy was talking about meant nothing, one way or the other. The last thing he wanted to do was to let Timothy know that he knew.
Susan smelled it too, Timothy said defensively. It woke her up. When Mom boils a lobster and when she steams clams, Susan can't stand the smell. She stays out on the lawn until supper's ready. You never get cross with her.
She's allergic to seafood, Cruson said. I've told you that many times, but it's mostly shellfish. That's why we never let her eat shellfish. It was an irrelevant remark, but Cruson felt it would encourage his son to talk more freely, and he no longer wanted him to stop.
It came right up out of the sea again, Timothy said. I can always tell, but when Susan smelled it, I knew it was getting bad. It will be like that now, even when it doesn't come back. Mom will smell it too.
Is that why you came rushing downstairs so fast, to find out if I smelled anything strange? Timothy shook his head.
I was scared you'd see it. That's worse than just smelling it. Mr. Forbes saw it and was nearly killed.
Cruson had forgotten for a moment what Timothy had said about feeling dizzy if he tried to walk, but now all of his concern came back. Get up, son, he said. Walk up and down a few times. We've got to make sure that bump on your head is nothing to worry about. Kids your age take so many tumbles you get in the habit of giving it little thought, but sometimes you don't worry enough. Timothy got up and walked back and forth until his father told him to stop. Any dizziness? Cruson asked.
No, Dad, I feel fine.
I'm glad. There's just one more thing I want you to do. Go upstairs and wake your mother up. Tell her I have to see her right away. And don't come back with her. Just go to your room and stay there. I've got to have a long, serious talk with her. If Timothy had the slightest inclination to disobey, it was not apparent in his behavior. He turned slowly and went back up the stairs, dragging his feet a little as if in sullen protest against parental dominance. 5 minutes later, Aunt Cruson was sitting at her husband's side, listening to what he was saying without making any attempt to interrupt him. The creaking of the couch, as she shifted her position almost continuously, was more revealing of the way she felt than her expression, for she was a woman who could endure a great deal of inner torment with composed features. Cruson carefully avoided so much as hinting at the torment that he had endured before his son's fall had made a horror beyond sane description waver and vanish. He started with Timothy's mishap, explaining that it was the crash that had awakened him, But he told her everything that their son had said, and when he had finished, he was almost sure, from the long silence which ensued, that her concern was now as great as his, and perhaps even surpassed it. Her voice, when she spoke, was slightly tremulous.
"We're very lucky, in a way, Ralph. Dr. Morehouse is not only a kindly and understanding man. He doesn't really belong in a town as small as East Windham, even though they have quite a large general hospital. I don't need to tell you how famous he has become. There are few child psychologists."
He started as a Jungian analyst. Cruson said, before she could continue, most of his patients in those days were troubled adults. He's still a Jungian, I've been told, but yes, he's a good man. I've never had anything against Jung, or Freud, for that matter, except that I've never been a convert to any kind of analytical therapy.
"Most people are today,"
Anne said. "No, I wouldn't say that exactly," Cruson said. "It's a big world, and we make a mistake when we let ourselves forget it."
"You picked a strange time to interpose objections," Anne said. "Timothy is more than just troubled. There are few adults—"
"That's not what you said when Timothy was sprawled out on the floor reading about the fall of Troy for the 50th time. I told you then that it was the wrong book, a very bad book for Timothy, even if a case could be made out for letting that kind of reading fall into the hands of comparatively well-balanced children for a while longer."
"I've changed my mind, that's all,"
Anne said. Cruson reached out and pressed his wife's hand. "I'm glad you have. I'll drive to East Windham and have a talk with Morehouse just as soon as you can perk some strong coffee. Make it 3 cups, black, no cream."
"That's unusual for you,"
Anne said, trying very hard to smile.
"You hate black coffee. Oh, hell, I'll boil you 2 eggs while I'm at it. It won't take more than 10 minutes.
Under ordinary circumstances, Cruson would have phoned Dr. Morehouse to check on his availability before driving to East Windham at so early an hour. But he needed to get out into the open in a speeding car regardless of the hour, and no matter how soon he arrived in the town, a period of waiting seemed inevitable, and he saw no reason for worrying about whether it would be long or comparatively short. Possibly, he told himself, an appointment could be arranged as early as 10 o'clock at Morehouse's residence, and if it had to be later at the hospital, where the psychiatrist was a staff therapist, East Windham was a pleasant enough town to keep the dread which darkened his thoughts from becoming overwhelming for a few hours. It turned out better than he had dared to hope, and a phone call to Morehouse's home on his arrival secured him an appointment at 9:30. The hour and a half of waiting which remained he spent roaming through the more ancient part of town, studying the old houses, some dating back to the 19th century, and talking for 20 minutes on the phone with Forbes in his private room at the hospital. The news he received was reassuring. Forbes' wound had been well attended to, and unless some complication developed, which seemed unlikely, he would be up and about again in a few days, and Miss Tanner was no longer under sedation. He arrived at Morehouse's home 10 minutes ahead of time, and was ushered into his quite large, tastefully furnished office, facing the street by his wife, a quiet-spoken, attractive woman who was quick to explain that his regular office hours were 11 to 1, and were followed by his duties at the hospital, which sometimes kept him occupied all night.
"Sometimes he sees patients earlier," she told Cruson. "He's been terribly busy in recent weeks. Everything's so uncertain today that people are taking up more and more of his time. I worry about the schedule he's imposed on himself."
She nodded and shut the door, and Cruson found himself staring across the sunlit room at a slightly stout, gray-haired man with thoughtful brown eyes and rather small features that were finely chiseled and verged on the handsome. There was nothing particularly distinguished about him, but there was something in his expression that inspired confidence at first glance. He arose from behind his desk, gestured to a chair drawn up opposite the desk, and sat down again. He did not offer his hand in greeting, but his first words put Cruson completely at ease.
"We have two mutual friends, it seems, but this is the first time I've had the great pleasure of meeting you in person. I understand you wish to talk to me about your son."
Cruson had debated with himself the wisdom of telling the composed, widely experienced man, who now sat facing him, everything that had happened since the previous afternoon, starting with Timothy's wild talk and the angry scene with his wife that had made him decide to go for a walk on the beach. He abruptly decided that he would be defeating his own purpose in seeking the psychiatrist's help if he kept anything back, including the appalling spectacle which had confronted him when he'd heaved himself over the rail of Forbes's boat. Quite possibly, Morehouse had talked with Forbes at the hospital and already knew about that. The emergency had been an unusual one, and a staff psychiatrist could well have been summoned to provide some immediate help, particularly since Helen Tanner had undergone a dangerous kind of hysterical collapse. It took Cruson close to half an hour to acquaint Morehouse with the sequence of occurrences that went far beyond what the psychiatrist could have surmised from just talking with Forbes, and he was careful to stress that not only were they sanity-threatening, but seemed to bear some frightening relationship to Timothy's state of mind. When he had finished, Morehouse remained for a long moment, staring at him with an inscrutable expression on his face. Then he arose quietly, walked to the window, and stared out, as if he needed an even longer moment to think over what he had been told. When he returned to the desk and resumed his seat, the inscrutable expression had vanished. It had been replaced by a look of restrained reassurance.
"Let me ask you something," he said. "Just what kind of a boy is your son? Oh, I know you've described him, but not sufficiently. Is he ever in the least outgoing, despite his tendency to engage in daydreaming a great deal of the time?"
"He can be," Cruson said, "with other kids, at times, and I guess you could say he is with me. He talks back, gets aggressive, and disobeys, but most of the time he's obedient enough."
"Children are always a little outgoing with their own parents," Morehouse said. "I wasn't really thinking of that. Is he the kind of boy who had a lot of bottled-up emotions he'd like to display in an aggressive way, despite his introspective tendencies? But he doesn't, simply because daydreaming seems easier and more emotionally satisfying to him, except at rare intervals. But then, once in a while, he lets go, really lets go. He blackens the eye of some kid he regards as a bully and gives a damn good account of himself in other ways. Am I describing him accurately?"
"Very," Cruson said.
"Just how familiar are you with the Jungian hypothesis in general?"
Morehouse asked. "Not too familiar," Cruson replied. "It covers so wide a territory, but I've dipped into Jung now and then." "You refer to it as a hypothesis," he couldn't resist adding. "Are you implying you don't accept the whole of Jung?"
"Naturally, I don't," Morehouse said. "If I did, then I'd be a bum psychiatrist from the word go. No mathematical physicist in his right mind would or could accept the whole of Einstein. It's the last thing Einstein would have wanted anyone to do."
A very earnest, serious expression came into Morehouse's eyes.
"Only one aspect of the Jungian hypothesis in general concerns me now. I'll try to discuss it as briefly as I can. It's the very familiar one, the one that 4 people out of 5, and that would take in the bartender at the cafe a block from here, would know what you were talking about if you mentioned it in casual conversation. I'm referring, of course, to man's collective unconsciousness, the repository of archetypal images which Jung was firmly convinced we all carry about us in the depths of our minds."
He paused for a moment, and though Cruson had more than an inkling of what Morehouse was about to say, he waited patiently for him to go on. Before doing so, Morehouse removed a cigarette from the package at his elbow, lit it, and took a few slow puffs.
Those archetypal images, he resumed, are often frightful, enormous snakes, and tribal effigies with chalk-white faces, and legendary kings with scepters of fire who practiced cruelty night and day. All that we know. But Jung even suggested, since there is no way of knowing how far the collective unconscious goes back in time, that images from a reptile stage or fish stage period of evolution may form a part of man's buried ancestral heritage, and that would explain the frequent appearance of archetypes as fanged and flying lizards, or even more hideous monsters from the sea.
Morehouse fell silent again, and Cruson found himself wondering with some concern if he had allowed the way he was staring at the psychiatrist to make him reluctant to say more. Very quickly he ceased to stare, looking beyond Morehouse to the glimmering patch of sunlight on the opposite wall. "Just what are you trying to tell me?" he asked. "It would be very hard for me to believe—"
"Yes, I know," Morehouse interposed. "It would be hard for me to believe it, too. But Jung once allowed himself to speculate. Wait, put it this way. What if a very imaginative child, or an adult, for that matter, with the bottled-up aggressive drives we've discussed, became abnormally stimulated in some way by something he had read? I mean, you see—"
"I'm afraid I don't see."
"I'm sure you do. It's always a mistake to conceal from ourselves what we would prefer not to believe."
"Aren't you doing that yourself right now? You just said—"
"I said it would be very hard for me to believe, and that's true. There's no dishonesty in that, but we do know that visual images, even when they're not archetypal, can seem more real to us if we link them to something we've read. A book of mythology, for instance, or, if you were a child in the Victorian age, the darkly frightening, even cruel world of fantasy conjured up by the Brothers Grimm."
"Are you trying to make me believe that an archetypal image in Timothy's mind took on form and substance, and—" Morehouse raised a protesting hand.
"I'm not asking you to believe anything. It's Timothy you're most concerned about, and so am I. You came here to consult me for no other reason. We've got to help Timothy, because when a sensitive, imaginative child with many fine qualities is in trouble, well, there's no greater tragedy."
"For God's sake," Cruson heard himself saying, "what do you suggest? What would you have me do?"
"Just listen carefully. Has Timothy ever spent the summer in a boys' camp, in everyday, relaxed contact with other kids his age? Has he ever gone in for bird-watching, and paddled around in a canoe, and played tennis and baseball, and engaged in a half-dozen other sports? Very strenuous ones, guaranteed to make him feel so tired at night he'll just drop down exhausted and sleep like a log until he's caught up in another day of activity."
"No, I'm afraid not," Cruson heard himself replying. "We never felt— It was partly his mother's fault. She couldn't bear the thought of not seeing him for 6 or 8 weeks, and he never cared much for sports, aside from baseball."
"There's a camp right here in East Windham," Morehouse said, "an excellent one, which I can personally recommend. I have a nephew Timothy's age, and he has spent 3 summers with the Weltons. It's in the deep woods by Sharon Lake, not 20 minutes' drive from the center of town."
"That means we could see him." Dr. Morehouse shook his head.
"No, I wouldn't advise that. If you love your son, you'll make him understand that when once he is deposited in the camp, he's staying there until fall. That will not prevent you from writing to him as often as you wish."
Cruson got slowly to his feet, and this time Morehouse reached across the desk and firmly clasped his hand.
"When Timothy comes back," he said, "you may find that your worries are at an end."
There was a telephone handset on Morehouse's desk, and Cruson tapped it with his forefinger.
"May I call my wife on this phone? I'd like to get this settled as quickly as possible." "By all means," Morehouse said. "I was just about to suggest it."
A moment later, Cruson was saying into the phone, "Anne, I want you to pack a few of Timothy's clothes in that small brown leather suitcase in the hall closet. Just an extra pair of trousers, sneakers, 2 or 3 flannel shirts. You know what you packed for him when he spent the weekend with your sister in Brookdale 2 summers ago. Everything he'll need for a few days away from home." "What's that?" "No, darling, I can't go into it now, but he'll be going on a short visit. Yes, I've talked with Dr. Morehouse, and I'm phoning from his home. It's something he felt was most urgent." Anne's voice came so frantically over the line that he had to hold the receiver away from his ears for a moment. When the protests stopped, he added, "Nothing to worry about, darling. Everything's fine. Timothy is going to be all right. I'll explain when I get back. I just want to be sure the suitcase is packed and that Timothy will be ready to leave with me when I drive up in the car. Right away. That's most important." He hung up before Anne could protest further. "You handled that very well," Morehouse said. Driving home on a road that skirted the sea for a mile or so at frequent intervals, Cruson kept turning over in his mind everything that Morehouse had said to him. It was hard for him to believe any part of it, and he very much doubted if Morehouse took more than 1/10 of it seriously. But in 1/10 of a far-out surmise there might reside just enough truth to make its dismissal an act of folly. What did the Jungians advise when a problem of that nature presented itself? Dismiss nothing as absolutely unbelievable. Watch every step you take. Tread cautiously. There may well be some kind of tenuous connection between the logically untenable and the mysterious nature of ultimate reality. Perhaps nothing so gross as a visual image, archetypal or otherwise, could be thought of as capable of separating itself from the mind, at least in part, and acquiring destructive physical attributes. But terrifying occurrences had seemingly taken place, which had come as no surprise to Timothy, and his wild talk had clearly established some kind of relationship between his thoughts and the occurrences. Perhaps Morehouse had been all wrong about the nature of those relationships, but just the fact that they appeared to exist made caution mandatory. The shape that had towered above the couch, with its eyes malignantly trained on him, had dwindled and vanished a few seconds after Timothy had tripped on the stairs and struck his head in falling. It seemed unlikely that the sudden blotting out of Timothy's consciousness could have been totally unrelated to the shape's disappearance. Unanticipated coincidences were perhaps common enough under ordinary circumstances, but when something happened that was both terrifying and unusual, how often did coincidence play a role as well? It was asking too much of the law of averages, was loading the dice in a totally unacceptable way. Cruson tightened his hold on the wheel of the speeding car, wishing the sea would not come into view so often. The breeze whipped at his hair, setting it to swirling on his brow and occasionally half blinding him. Suddenly, the long ledge of rock where Forbes's boat was still bobbing about in the tide came into view, and all of his apprehension vanished. It was close enough to the cottage now to bring the car flush with the garage, leap out and cross the lawn in 8 or 10 long strides. 20 seconds later, he was doing just that, the wind still whipping at his hair. He was almost at the door of the cottage when the wind brought so strong an odor of decaying shellfish to his nostrils that he came to an abrupt halt. He started to turn to see if the odor became stronger when he faced the wharf, but before he'd swung completely about, he realized it could only be coming from the cottage. The tide was at its full, and there were no mudflats from which it could have been carried by the wind. He remained for an instant motionless, facing the door without jerking it open, choosing to listen instead. The slightest sound from within the cottage, light, unhurried footsteps, Anne's voice or that of the children talking back and forth, would have dispelled the fear which had come upon him, and he desperately needed such reassurance. It was worth waiting for 5, 6, 7 seconds. Waiting longer was unthinkable, and when no sounds came to his ears, he grasped the doorknob, gave it a violent wrench, and entered the cottage in a kind of stumbling rush. He almost stumbled over Anne. She was lying slumped on the floor, just inside the door, her face drained of all color. He was instantly on his knees at her side, slipping one arm under her shoulder and raising her to a sitting position. She moaned and stirred a little, but he had to shake her and plead with her to say something, anything, before her terrible limpness vanished, and she leaned heavily against him, her voice coming in choking gasps.
"Ralph, it's horrible. Half fish, half hairy animal. I tried to make it let go of Timothy, and it hurled me across the room. Everything went hazy for a minute. I thought my back was broken. If you hadn't started shaking me—"
Her hand went out and fastened on his wrist.
"You've got to get to them. Timothy was screaming, and Susan."
"Both of the children?" Cruson couldn't seem to breathe. "Where are they? I don't see them."
"It dragged Timothy upstairs, and Susan ran after them. I couldn't stop her."
"All right. Careful now," Cruson cautioned. "Just lean back against the wall when I take my arm away. Don't twist about, and don't try to get up."
"I won't, but hurry, darling. It may not be too late."
Cruson got swayingly to his feet, and in another moment was mounting the stairs, ascending to the floor above with a nightmarish feeling of unreality, making it hard for him to believe it wasn't happening to someone else. Sunlight was streaming in through the two small windows in the upper hallway, but there was a swirling curtain of mist at the end of the hall, which prevented him from seeing into Timothy's room. Since Timothy seldom closed the door on summer days, Cruson didn't expect to find it shut, but the thought that it might be gave him little concern. He felt fully capable of battering it down, and he moved now with the steadiness of purpose which, for an instant, had almost deserted him on the stairs. The odor of decaying shellfish became sickening as the mist swirled up about him, forcing him to cover his face with his hand. Then he was inside the room, staring up with his hand lowered, feeling wetness start up on his forehead and turn into a cold trickling which ran down both cheeks to his throat. Timothy was suspended between floor and ceiling by long tendrils of mist that crisscrossed and held him enmeshed, as if he had stumbled by accident into a vast glowing spiderweb and been elevated to its exact center by his own furious struggles to escape. Lower down in the web, Susan Jane was also enmeshed, but she had seemingly given up struggling and dangled as limply as a calico doll tossed carelessly across a bedpost for the night. Behind the bed, a huge shape towered, beaked and taloned, and faintly rimmed with sunlight from a window which its bulk had 9/10 blocked out. When Timothy saw his father, he stopped struggling so abruptly that his limbs seemed still in motion, for the web continued to tremble for a moment in the same violent way. Timothy could not have looked more frightened and despairing, and that seemed to be keeping him from surrendering to another kind of emotion. It was only what he said that startled Cruson and made him stare unbelievingly.
"If you don't go, it will kill you, Dad. I don't want you to die. Tell Mom goodbye. I love her very much. You too, Dad."
Timothy's voice seemed so startlingly calm and adult, it was hard for Cruson to realize it was his own son speaking. Cruson's throat had tightened up, and for an instant he could say nothing in reply. His mouth felt as dry as death, and that made speaking even more difficult. But he made a supreme effort, and when he heard himself saying, "No one in this house is going to die, Timothy," his voice seemed even calmer than Timothy's had been.
"I can't get free, Dad," Timothy said, "and Susan can't either. But if you go right back downstairs, it may not kill you."
"Listen to me," Cruson pleaded. "Stop thinking. Can you do that? Try. Make your mind a total blank. I'm not here. You're not here. You're in a different place, and you've stopped thinking about anything. You're just waiting for something to happen. It's so wonderful, so certain to happen, you don't even have to give it a thought." Cruson suddenly realized that he'd let himself forget that Timothy was only 9. Could a trance-like state, with all immediate awareness blotted out, be self-induced by a boy that young, and bring about a change in his conscious thinking? If he failed to comprehend exactly what he was being urged to do, Timothy seemed to understand, for his expression changed, and although he continues to look directly at his father, an unmistakable look of remoteness began to creep into his eyes. "You're far away, Timothy," Cruson murmured. "There's nothing to be afraid of, and you're being protected from all harm, and you're not letting anything frighten you. You're thinking about nothing at all, because you know that thinking can make people unhappy for no reason at all." It happened more quickly than Cruson had dared to hope. The beaked and darkly towering shape behind the web began to waver and dissolve. First the shining beak vanished, and then the ghastly bulk of the creature dwindled and fell away, until nothing remained of it between the web and the window but a few floating filaments of mist that took just a little longer to disappear. The web vanished then, in a sudden, almost blinding burst of light, and both children tumbled to the floor. If Timothy had been shaken up by the fall, or was still a little under the sway of the trance that had brought a look of remoteness into his eyes, he displayed no evidence of it. He was almost instantly on his feet, helping his sister to rise. As soon as both children were on their feet, Cruson hurried them out of the room without saying a word, gripping Timothy by the wrist and encircling Susan Jane's waist almost fiercely with his free arm. His only thought was to keep Timothy from talking about any part of what had happened until they were downstairs and out of the house, and Timothy began remembering before they were halfway down the stairs.
"Dad, for a minute I didn't know where I was. What happened?"
"You just now helped Susan to get up," Cruson told him.
"You mean you did that with your mind blank?" "I must have, Dad. How did we get away? It was going to kill me and Susan, and I told you—"
"Your mother may be badly hurt," Cruson said. "Think about that. Nothing else." They were at the bottom of the stairs now, and Cruson saw with relief that Anne was coming toward them across the sun parlor. She was holding herself very straight, and had the look of a fully recovered woman whose only emotion was one of overwhelming gratefulness. She started to speak, but her voice broke, and although Cruson knew how much time a family reunion could consume, he released his tight grip on Timothy and Susan Jane and let them run straight into Anne's outstretched arms. He wasn't sure he had done a wise thing, and spoke almost harshly to make his wife realize that all rejoicing must be cut short. "We're getting out of the house and into the car and driving to East Windham right now," he said. "Timothy won't be needing the suitcase I told you to pack. He'll be having the time of his life at a boys' camp, camping, hiking, swimming, well into October. We can buy him everything he'll need in East Windham tomorrow. We may even get there today before the stores close." Anne looked at him out of eyes swimming with tears.
"You got to them in time," she said. "Nothing else matters. I'll miss Timothy, you know that, but if a boys' summer camp is what he worked out for him with Dr. Morehouse, I won't say a word."
"He couldn't be any more tanned than he is now," Cruson said, "but otherwise you won't know him when he comes back in October. He'll have a real rough-and-tumble look." He gripped his wife's hand and pressed his lips to her cheek. "Come on," he said, leading the way to the door. "We haven't a moment to lose." The children followed.
"Thank you, darling,"
Anne said, as they passed out into the clear, bright sunlight.